down in the south.
Okay,
Okay.
well, we got here somewhere, I'm gonna double check too now that you said that. I think, let's see. Yeah, I've got you listed too, so I think.
Okay.
All right. Anything else, with respect to the minutes? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
I so move, Commissioner Bailey.
And a second?
Second, Commissioner Weiss.
Commissioner Weiss, all right. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the minutes are approved. All right. Now, let's go on to, I lost the agenda. Why would you go ahead? Here we go. All right, I got it now. Yeah, I'll get back up. Boy, this is not been a fun day. All right, we have concepts here, emission guidelines for GHG emissions from the oil and gas sector. And Ms. Clement.
Good morning. All right. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Katie Quinlan with DAQ Rural Development Branch, and I'll be presenting a concept for some upcoming rules to implement EPA's emission guidelines for control of greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and natural gas sector. So this slide is just for reference, some acronyms and abbreviations that we use throughout. And I want to start with the next few slides covering the background behind this rule. So we're going to jump in at 2012 when EPA promulgated the first new source performance standards for the crude oil and natural gas sector under 40 CFR Part 60 Subpart Quad O. And those were to control VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, and sulfur dioxide from affected facilities within that source category. And then 4 years later, the EPA finalized in 2016 amendments to Subpart Quad O to improve implementation. And they also promulgated a new Subpart Quad O-A, which included VOC requirements that were already in Subpart Quad O, and then new provisions for control of greenhouse gas emissions in the form of methane, and for VOCs across an expanded crude oil and natural gas sector category. So then in 2020, there were a couple of actions, the most notable being a 2020 policy rule, where EPA rescinded some specific requirements of Subpart Quad O-A in response to a review of the NSPS that was initiated by an executive order. But we do want to note that that 2020 policy rule was disapproved under the Congressional Review Act of in June of 2021, thus reinstating those requirements. So then later in 2021, in response to a different executive order, 13990, which is titled Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis, the EPA proposed revisions to the NSPS for methane and VOC emissions that were already codified in subparts Quad O and Quad O-A. And then they also proposed a new NSPS under subpart Quad O-B for limiting methane and VOC emissions from new, modified, and reconstructed facilities that were not previously regulated under subparts Quad O and Quad O-A. And in the same proposal, EPA proposed new emission guidelines with presumptive standards for greenhouse gas emissions in the form of methane limitations under subpart Quad O-C. And so about a year later, in December 2022, EPA published a supplemental proposal. And that supplemental proposed rule was composed of two main additions. The EPA updated, strengthened, and expanded on their proposal for the new NSPS in subpart Quad O-B, and that was for GHGs in the form of methane and VOC emissions, and those covered new, modified, and reconstructed facilities in the source category. And then they also updated, strengthened, and expanded the presumptive standards proposed in the emission guidelines under subpart Quad O-C for greenhouse gas emissions in the form of methane limitations. And those are for existing designated facilities. And we've just copied the definition of the term designated facility to the bottom of the slide. The main point being we just want to differentiate between an affected facility, which is what's covered under an NSPS, and then the term designated facility being used for emission guidelines. And essentially a designated facility is a facility that would be an affected facility or subject to an NSPS if it were new, if it were an affected facility. And so in late last year, EPA announced the final rule. So they finalized the November 2021 proposal and the December 2022 supplemental proposal, and they published those final rules in the Federal Register on March 8th with an effective date of today, May 8th, 2024. And so that emission guideline provides states 2 years from the effective date of the final rule to submit their state plans for Quad OC. And so this slide is hopefully summarizing that history, or just kind of where we stand today, I guess. So this is adapted from Table 2 of the Federal Register publication for the final rule. And the first 3 rows are listing the 3 NSPS sources that are codified under, or that are promulgated under Clean Air Act Section 111B. So that's Quad O, Quad OA, and Quad OB. Those are for new, modified, or reconstructed sources that fall within one of those date ranges. And then the last line is for the emission guidelines under Quad OC, and those are for existing sources that were existing on or before December 6, 2022, and it just covers methane emissions. And those are promulgated by the EPA under Clean Air Act Section 111D. And you might notice there's some overlap of the dates between the emission guidelines and then what the applicable dates are for Quad O and Quad OA. We're still kind of looking into this. It's a little bit of a different configuration than what we see a lot of the time for these NSPS and emission guidelines. But it appears that there are, well, I'll back up. In the final rule, there was also some language added to Quad O and Quad OA to specify when a source transitions from being subject to those NSPS to then being subject to a more stringent, if there is a more stringent standard in a state plan or federal plan pursuant to the emission guideline. So there's kind of a transition there for some of those sources. And so this diagram was taken, this is a diagram that EPA has in their presentations that they've been giving to cover the NSPS and the emission guidelines. And it kind of shows their map of the crude oil and natural gas source category, and it divides it into 3 different segments. The first being production and processing, so that covers well sites, storage tank batteries, gathering and boosting compressor stations, and natural gas processing plants. That's what's shown in the blue boxes 1 through 4. And then there's the natural gas transmission and storage segment shown in the orange boxes 5 and 6. And that covers compressor stations and storage tank batteries. And then what's shown in gray 7, 8, and 9 is the distribution segment. And that includes distribution mains and services, city gates, and regulators and meters for customers. And those are not covered. What's in gray is not covered by EPA's rules. We're still refining what types of these sources we have in North Carolina. We do have some compressor stations, so under number 5, and then we're kind of looking, we may have some under number 4 or 6, but we're still refining that list. There are different thresholds for what might be subject according to what their potential to emit is. So we don't have anything under like 1 through 3, for example. And so backing up, I want to just kind of briefly cover what North Carolina's Clean Air Act obligations are generally for NSPS and emission guidelines. So NSPS that are promulgated under Clean Air Act Section 111B are directly applicable to facilities, and those are automatically incorporated by the state via Rule 02D 524. So there's no direct resulting need for rulemaking from the DAQ as a part of the NSPS. But emission guidelines that are promulgated under Section 111D are not directly applicable to facilities. Instead, those specify requirements for states and local and tribal air agencies that wish to regulate their sources to develop standards that apply to designated facilities within their jurisdiction. And this specific emission guideline gives states 2 years from the rule to develop and submit their plans to EPA for reducing methane from existing sources. So state plans. State plans generally must set compliance deadlines that are no later than 36 months after those plans are due to EPA. And the states have to follow the requirements of the state plan implementing regulations that are in Subpart BA of Part 60. And those were just revised late last year in November. So we're also looking at those revised requirements. So here in this concept, what we're really trying to say is that we're proceeding, nothing's required from us from a rulemaking standpoint for Quad OB, but Quad OC is going to require us to adopt some rules to implement those requirements. And so stepping back, emission guideline procedures from a broad overview involves 3 kind of main broad steps. There's a lot of intermediate steps in between these, but This is kind of the procedure that it goes through. So EPA first identifies the best system of emission reduction, or BSER, for existing sources within that source category. Then states have to establish standards of performance for designated facilities within their jurisdiction based on applying that BSER that EPA determined in the emission guideline. So for North Carolina, we'll codify those standards into state rules, and then we will incorporate those state rules into a state plan for submittal to EPA. And then finally, regulated sources comply with the standards using either BSER or non-BSER methods. So for these specific emission guidelines under subpart Quad OC, the state plans have to demonstrate that the state's standards of performance meet the equivalency criteria specified in the emission guidelines when compared to EPA's presumptive standards of performance that were issued in the emission guideline Quad OC. Again, the rule gives states 2 years to develop their standards of performance and submit their state plans to EPA, and then the designated facilities are required to meet the standards that are established by the state within 36 months of when the state submits their state plan. And so there are tables within the final Federal Register publication for the final rule that go through all the different requirements by specific type of source within the source category. It would cover many, many slides, and as we showed earlier, there's lots of them that we don't have sources under those. So just pointing to Table 4, which contains a summary of the final BSER determinations and the presumptive standards of performance for each type of designated facility within the source category. And then Section X of the preamble, or Section 10, contains a complete discussion of these final provisions. And so the final emission guideline in Quad OC includes a model rule also that states can follow. It contains the presumptive standards of performance with associated monitoring, reporting, and record-keeping provisions. And so we mentioned before that subpart BA included or was revised last year. And one of the requirements in there was a requirement to document meaningful engagement conducted by the state. So under 40 CFR 60.23a, the state plan has to include documentation of meaningful engagement, including a list of identified pertinent stakeholders and their representatives, a summary of the engagement conducted, and a summary of stakeholder input and how it was considered in the development of the plan. And so those pertinent stakeholders include, but are not limited to, industry, small businesses, and communities that are most affected by or vulnerable to the impacts of the state plan. And EPA provided some examples of the meaningful engagement that they conducted when they were promulgating these rules. And that for them included meetings, training webinars, roundtables, public listening sessions, and a technical workshop. And so the DAQ has already started holding discussions with our public affairs office for DAQ on outreach recommendations and how to meaningfully engage with the communities and businesses affected by this rulemaking. So as I mentioned, currently we're still reviewing the final emission guideline. There's a lot of requirements, a lot of standards in there. And we're looking at the revised state plan implementing regulations. We're refining our list of designated facilities in North Carolina, and we're determining overall the scope of our rulemaking and the meaningful engagement that we'll be conducting. And so we plan to proceed by finalizing that scope of the rulemaking and the list of designated facilities. We'll draft rules and a fiscal note or regulatory impact analysis, and conduct the outreach to pertinent stakeholders that are affected by the rulemaking. This is just a tentative overview of the timeline for this rulemaking. Based on this, we expect to be back in September with draft rules and a fiscal note, and then requesting from the EMC to proceed to comment and hearing in November. We will be looking at a comment period sometime over the winter, or late this year, early next year. And based on this, we're looking at a tentatively effective rule next summer. And with that, I can take any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Quinlan? Commissioner Bailey?
That's okay. I don't know who raised their hand first.
Well, you spoke first.
Okay, Commissioner Bailey, I just wanted to know, I guess I'm interested in an update at the July meeting about, instead of just having the rules presented in September, can we get an update in July about where you're at with this process and identifying the stakeholders?
Yes, I think we can put something together for the July meeting.
All right. So that would be an appropriate information line.
Yep.
That was it. That was a follow-up.
If you could include, in the, meeting materials, the list of affected parties.
Sure.
Thank you.
Anything else for Ms. Quinn? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's go to the next presentation, which is revisions to permit review timelines and definitions as a result of the new session law. This is Ms. Pickett.
This is potentially a very brief one. This is a follow-up presentation. Here's our acronyms right here. So previously there's been presentations on the session law and the updates to those. In fact, Director Abrazaskis has presented those previously, so this is a follow-up. This is a narrow rulemaking. It's just going to be in regard to Section 1211 of the session law, and that was titled Air Permitting Review and Issuance of Timelines. So part of the introduction of these new timelines is that there will be a start point for the timeline, and that heavily relies on this new definition. So they go hand in hand, and so this rulemaking will be incorporating both of those aspects. So there's a limited amount of background on this, but here it is. So there are two separate timelines that are coming forward. There's going to be a 90-day and a 270-day. And the distinction between those is which ones are going for what type of permit modifications. This session law is creating a new concept of a modification being minor or major. This distinction was not previously identified, so that is another component of this rulemaking to consider. And this slide also includes the full definition, which will be incorporated in its entirety within our rulemaking for that new term, administratively complete. And you can see it here. It means that all information required by statute, regulation, or application form has been submitted to the department for the purposes of processing a permit application. And that's going to start the timeline of those countdowns for 90 days or the 270 days. The end of that will be notice to the facility owner and operator as to what action. So, the permit will be issued, denied, or, which is often common in Title V permits, the notice to the public. So there's a public comment period. So all three of those are acceptable endpoints for this time period. As far as where we are in the concept phase, this is still early on. At this point, all of the O2Q rules have been reviewed in consideration in light of this rule. The way that the O2Q section, which is the permitting section of our rules, there's a lot of interplay as far as timelines, and most of those are direct requirements of what the federal EPA requires of the division for the permitting. So those were identified and flagged. We're still in the concept stage. We're still working with internal stakeholders as far as coming up with the strategy to incorporate this and make sure that our current rules are in consideration of these new 90-day and 270-day timeline. And it's like an overlay on top of all the other timelines and requirements of our permitting process. So because of this complexity, we're looking at bringing draft rules in September. That gives us a little time to make sure we get this right, put together a really robust fiscal analysis for this rulemaking action. And if we follow through, we're looking at a potentially effective date in June of next year, 2025. And that is the end of the presentation.
Any questions for Ms. Pickett? Commissioner Weiss?
Thank you, Chairman Carter. This may be premature, but I was wondering if there is any mechanism for pausing the review clock once it starts, if something, what could be encountered that might cause that clock to need to be stopped and whether or not there's the potential for doing that.
So currently under our rules, there are several rules which address permit processing, how it goes. There's ones for your regular permit application. There's ones for permit modifications, for minor sources and significant sources, not to be confused with minor and major modifications to the permit. Those are two separate concepts. It is a little tricky. So keeping all of that in play, right now, we're still figuring that out as far as an answer, but that's something that we can bring forward and make sure that we answer in its completeness at the September meeting.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Ms. Pickett? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll move to our action item, the request to take a change in PM 2.5 standard to the commission. Mr. Nelson is going to present that to us.
I'm Brad Nelson. I'm with the planning section of the Division of Air Quality. I'm here presenting proposed revisions to 15A NCAC 02D 0410 PM 2.5 particulate matter. Seem to want to change the
This one's not kind of, this one's still in presentation mode.
Next, these are just a list of acronyms that you may see during the presentation. For background, the O2D 0410 are annual and 24 ambient air quality standards for PM 2.5. These standards are set by the EPA in the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Some of the other pollutants that they also regulate are CO2, carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and sulfur dioxide. The first primary standard for PM 2.5 was established in 1997. The Clean Air Act requires a review of these standards every 5 years. They were reviewed in 2006, 2012, and 2020. The 2020 review, they retained the standards as they were established in 2012. But in 2021, the EPA reconsidered that 2020 decision. And based on that reconsideration, they revised the annual standard for the PM 2.5 from 12 micrograms per meter cubed to 9 micrograms per meter cubed, and retained the 24-hour PM standard at 35 micrograms. The rule was published in March and is now effective here May 6, 2024. So essentially, the DAQ is proposing to revise the ambient air quality standard for PM 2.5 and 15A NCAC 02D 0410 to incorporate to revise the annual standard from 12 to 9. Based on data, I guess they presented for the concept last time, there were 18 monitors that are used for the design value, and 14 of those were in attainment. There were 4 that were not. 2 of those monitors, the one in Wake County and Forsyth County, use a Teledyne monitor which overestimates the PM 2.5, and those numbers have now been changed, I guess, to address those overcompensations. We have recently certified the monitoring data for on April 30th. So now we have 2 monitors that are still above the standard. And this is a kind of a map. You'll see that the Wake County and the Forsyth County, there are now will be the Wake County, Forsyth is 8.1 and the Forsyth is 8.3, so they've now been adjusted, and we'll update this map here with the latest data when we go to the EMC. The designation process is a 2-year process where the EPA will designate the areas as attainment or non-attainment. The process will include the state input as well as opportunity for the public to comment on it. The EPA has said it will consider impacts from wildfire smoke in their designations, and so we are currently working on providing data for those exceptional events for the 2 monitors that are above the standard as of right now, and we'll present that, I guess, to the EPA in 2025, and ultimately the EPA will make those final designations in 2026 using the 2022 through 2024 monitoring data. And this is just kind of the different timeline, I guess, for the designation process. Essentially, the initial notification to submit the exceptional events date, which would be January 1st, 2025, and then we'll present the data, the recommendations for those exceptional events by November 7th, 2025. In the EPA's regulatory impact analysis, they looked at not only the final standard that they chose, but they also looked at some other alternatives based different annual standards or 24-hour standards. The EPA did identify 2 counties in North Carolina as possibly having control costs, but that was only for the standard of the using 8 milligrams per meter cubed. For the standard that they chose, there are no costs associated, or the EPA estimated there were no costs, control costs associated for North Carolina for the 9 standard that they chose. They also estimated the health benefits of 5.3 for the Southeast region, which also includes Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, and Florida. There's, we won't be able to know, or they did not break that down by state. So it's, but we expect there may be some benefits from neighboring states if they have to reduce their standard to meet their emissions to meet the new standard. For our regulatory impact, we relied on the EPA RIA. The one thing that we did see is that there would be some uncertainties associated with cost to the industry, because we probably we can't estimate impacts for projects that do not move forward as a result of them not being able to demonstrate compliance with the standard. They would do that internally versus submitting that to the DAQ. So we have no idea of what facilities may expand or may come into the state. So we're recommending that the committee approve the proposed rule amendments to 15A NCA 02D 0410 and the regulatory impact analysis to proceed to the EMC for approval to proceed to public comment. Here's the timeline. We presented the concept at the last meeting, and now we are presenting the draft rules and regulatory impact analysis to the AQC. And were there any questions?
Any questions for Mr. Nelson?
One clarifying question. I got lost in your discussion.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I got lost in the discussion of Wake County and Forsyth County. So I know the PowerPoint presentation said that based on the 2021-2023 monitoring data, there were 4 monitors in 4 counties that exceeded the standard.
Correct.
Then I think you said something after that about now we're down to 2.
Right
Is
there.
that based on the 2023
Yes,
monitoring data that's not yet certified?
it is certified.
It is certified now.
Right, it is certified. The Wake County and the Forsyth County use a Teledyne monitor that overestimates the PM 2.5. EPA has provided us with a correction, so we've applied the correction to that data now, and so now both those monitors are now under the 9 limit, I guess.
Okay. So at this point, there are no counties in North Carolina that would exceed.
Well, there's the 2 that are exceeding now on the certified data, but we are going to provide, I guess, this exceptional fence for the wildfire smoke to, I guess, reduce those numbers down to where they are below or where they are in attainment with the standard.
One follow-up. So you're saying that, is it Mecklenburg and Davidson
Right.
are the 2 that currently exceed the standard, but
Right.
that's where the wildfire data would be?
Right. The exceptional events where we would present the exceptional events to the EPA, and those, if approved, they would be determined to be in attainment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to add a little bit of additional explanation there. Again, that bias correction at the Wake County and Forsyth County monitors, that was an EPA national action. It wasn't even specific to North Carolina. every monitor of that type across the US where data was collected, EPA applied the same algorithm to adjust that data nationwide for that known high bias compared to federal reference method data that's more precise. So I hope that clarifies that. So that does leave the 2 monitors that are now still showing data above the level of the new standard, but Brad's exactly right. Our highest priority is working on exceptional events demonstrations over the remainder of 2024 to submit those in early 2025 with our designation recommendation for the state, then showing that after you exclude those exceptional events days at the 2 remaining monitoring sites, that we are in attainment statewide. So and things changed since we created the slides for this committee meeting, so I apologize for that. We had to kind of adjust on the fly here, but just the timing of the EPA bias correction or adjustments and the certification of our data occurred last week.
One question about the monitors. Does that mean, that sounds like that you've got different monitors at different locations in it?
Yes, sir. We have a variety of continuous monitors, including a few of the type that has the known high bias now. Then we also have a few remaining old school filter-based federal reference method monitors at a few sites, but not many of those. They're a little bit more labor intensive, much more expensive to operate. So we've transitioned to mostly continuous based monitors. And the benefit of that is obvious. You don't have all the expense related to filter weighing and all the chain of custody issues, but also you're providing real-time continuous data to the public in real time as well, rather than every 3 days collecting a filter, weighing it in a lab, and then providing that data a month later to the public. So big trade-offs there with different monitoring types.
One other thing on the, you mentioned that the 2 that were high or potential high were Mecklenburg and Davidson County.
Right.
I'm thinking those counties are somewhat separated. Is there a reason for the highs on those 2 and not the county?
Those 2 sites have always been amongst the highest fine particulate sites in the state due to just the unique mix of sources and distance from sources, perhaps. But again, if not for the exceptional events, that is the Canadian wildfires of 2023, we wouldn't even be having so much of this discussion, and we'd be showing a map that shows all of our sites in attainment of a much more stringent standard. And again, it's our intent to go through that process for the remainder of 2024, submit an approvable demonstration to EPA, and then our state's recommendation would be attainment when we have to submit that in February of 25.
Okay, that's fine. Anyone else have, Commissioner Deerhake?
Thank you. And Davidson County's always sort of lingered there at the upper levels, and at one time it was lightheartedly referred to because of the barbecue that are there.
Right.
I don't know how real that is or not, but the Mecklenburg in particular, the existing conditions, and when you layer the wildfire on top of the existing conditions, is what put it over the top, you're saying. And so in Mecklenburg's case, the existing conditions are those comprised not only of stationary sources, but also the mobile sources?
Yes, ma'am. It's the unique mix of all sorts of sources and of direct fine particulates, and then also precursors that form particulate matter in the atmosphere. So it's fairly complex because many people don't know this, most of the fine particles that we monitor in ambient air is secondarily formed from gaseous emissions.
Right.
And not so much directly emitted PM. That's a very small fraction of the total fine particulate in our ambient air. So that there's a very complex set of interactions. We've done lots of modeling for years. And then back to your comment on Davidson County, I think that the barbecue joints are safe. No attribution there to that being a significant cause or contributor to that.
I wouldn't call them joints, it's fine dining.
It's fine. Absolutely.
It's a North Carolina tradition.
Absolutely.
The secondary aerosol particulates, that's the result of NOx and SOx reacting with ammonia more than anything else. It's ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate. And so, as you know, I've been very interested in ammonia air quality in this state for a long time and continue to be, and would love to see more ammonia monitoring around the state. So, and the other thing, if I may, Mr. Chairman, just an observation about the RIA. Here we have a very thorough federal RIA performed for a national standard. There are parallels in water quality too that we can learn from on this. But I'm assuming they did not estimate cost impacts because after wildfires, the state was deemed in compliance. Is that correct? Did they just not go through the cost estimating exercise, or could you explain that, why they didn't estimate any costs for North Carolina?
What the EPA modeled the emissions, I guess, for future years, and what they found is that if the standard was 8 micrograms per meter cubed, that these two counties, it would exceed that. And so they applied, I guess, control costs to lower those emissions below the standard. So they did have costs for those two counties, I guess, if they chose the alternative 8 micrograms per meter cubed, but because they chose the 9, there were, both those counties were meeting the standards, so therefore there were no control costs.
And has OSBM already approved this RIA?
Correct, but we do plan to make a few changes based on the data being certified now, and we want to go ahead and change the map that's in there to show that those counties are in compliance now.
I guess my last comment about performing RIAs at the state level versus the federal level. When you have a federal standard that's being developed and promulgated, EPA has so many more resources that they can invest, as you know, Chairman Carter, in performing RIAs, and their documents are quite exhaustive. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Lyle.
Yeah, thanks. I had a couple questions. Number one, in a lot of the federal programs I'm involved in on the health side, there's an analysis of the populations being monitored and the diversity associated with that. As you look at air monitoring, do you consider, is it populations at all, or is it just geography? Is there any sense that representative monitoring is an issue that might be raised now or in the future?
Yeah, I do not know.
I can add a little bit to that, Mr. Chairman. In the standard setting process that EPA goes through, they consider many of the factors that you mentioned and you're familiar with. But in terms of the state's requirement to do ambient air quality monitoring, it's more of a population threshold that triggers a certain number of monitors in, say, a metropolitan statistical area. And just recently, are we now doing more of an environmental justice analysis of where those monitors have been cited? But traditionally, those factors that you mentioned are not considered. And as I think you were here during the ambient monitoring section presentation a couple of meetings ago, how complex citing just one monitor can be for the state when we aren't purchasing land to put that monitor on. We're coming into cooperative agreements with usually another public entity like a school that meets very rigorous citing criteria established by EPA that we have to meet, and that leaves very few spots when you start looking at the map. But we are very proud that that our existing monitoring network, we have more than half of our sites
in or near EJ communities, as an example.
Right. So again, it's not only that diversity, but the kind of urban-rural mix in the sense that the PM 2.5 sources over the past 2 decades, looks like it's changed from the fixed sites to something different. And if those monitoring sites are fixed or they haven't changed, are they really accurately representing that? And some of the speciation data I've seen is, ammonia concentrations in the southeast part of the state, those seem to be more prominent, and the neurotoxicity associated with that is something that people have, thought about as far as, that southeast corridor with a very high Alzheimer's risk and so forth. So again, not that there's an answer, but thanks for the response. And I can understand how challenging that would be to find appropriate sites for these monitoring. It's something to think about.
The other big challenge is everyone wants a monitor. And we don't even have the resources to meet the federal requirements for the minimum monitoring network. For example, PM 2.5, we have just enough to maintain that. So that's another challenge for us. And then back to some of the secondary formation comments, as NOx and SOx have been driven down, the importance of secondarily formed organic aerosols from VOC emissions have come up. So that's another piece we haven't mentioned, and very complex because the source of those VOC emissions in North Carolina is largely vegetation. And so it's a complex mix for sure, and changing over time, where ammonium sulfate and ammonium nitrate have been driven down. Secondary organic aerosols have not changed, but the relative percentage contribution has increased. I can talk all day about particulates.
Nothing to do. Any other commissioners have any questions? Mr. Nelson or for the director? All right, then thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the rest of our agenda here, there are two, you'll see there are 2 action items listed for tomorrow.
Chair?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'd like to make a motion.
Excuse me?
I'd like to make a motion.
Oh, thank you. I had already messed up on this earlier about something else. Thank you very much. Thanks to Mr. Nelson. And now I would like a motion to forward this package to the EMC at the July meeting.
Thank you. I move to have the committee approve the proposed rule amendments to 15A NCAC 02D.0410 and accompanying regulatory impact analysis to proceed to the EMC for approval to proceed to public comment.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
A second.
Commissioner Lyerly seconds. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it, and it passes, and we'll pass this on to the commission. Now I'll move on and say that there are 2 action items on the agenda for the commission tomorrow. I think it's 2, but my computer is still not helping me out, and I think that's it, unless the director has some further remarks he wants to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nothing further other than to say thank you to the staff. It's State Employees Appreciation Week, so I just want to say I appreciate you. Thank you very much for all the great work. And it's also Air Quality Awareness Week nationally, and also so proclaimed by the governor. So happy Air Quality Awareness Week. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And with that, unless another commissioner has something we need to bring up right now, I'm going to declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.